Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on AI and bias in tech recruitment. We will be getting started in about 30 seconds. We're just giving people the chance to sign in. And while you're waiting, feel free to scan the code here on the screen to follow us on LinkedIn. That way you can stay up to date with our latest webinars, but also blog articles, product updates, and more. Okay. I'd say that's about 30 seconds. Let's get started. Hello, Ed and Geraldo, and hello to everyone in the audience. I am your host today. My name is Natalie, and I'm part of the marketing team here at CoderPad. Thank you again for taking the time to join us as we talk about AI and bias in tech recruitment. So my hope is that you'll leave this webinar today with a better understanding of how you can apply AI to your tech hiring while mitigating bias. But before we dive in, I wanted to quickly share some practical information. So first things first, I would like to introduce my colleague Alice, or CoderPad, as you see her here. She's working behind the scenes, making sure that everything is running smoothly. If you do need help with anything at all, you can reach out to her in the chat. Secondly, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and that you will receive the recording in the next few days. Finally, there will be time for a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them in the Q&A tab. You can do so at any time throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer them all. So after this quick introduction, we'll meet our expert panelists. We will then move on to a roundtable style discussion before moving on to the live Q&A session. So that's more than enough from me. Let me introduce you to our pros. I'm joined today by Edward Pedini and Gerardo Tobar. Lauren Ho was meant to be joining us today, but unfortunately she had to withdraw for personal reasons. So Gerardo very kindly stepped in last minute. Thank you again for being here. And panelists, do you think you could tell us a little bit about yourself? Let's start with Ed and then Gerardo.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ed Pedini. I'm the head of customer advocacy at SeekOut. We are a SaaS platform, a talent intelligence suite that helps teams find the talent they need and grow the talent they have. And we have AI embedded right throughout our application in a AI-assisted, human-powered type solution that we'll talk maybe a little bit more about today. Previous to SeekOut, I worked as a recruiter and a recruiting leader in lots of different industries. Did that agency in-house and in the RPO model. I used to be a customer of SeekOut before joining the organization as well. So this is a topic that's very close to my heart, both from a profession standpoint and from a company standpoint. And excited to be here today to answer your questions and share our top thoughts on what's a very hot topic at the moment.
Thank you, Ed.
All right, thanks. So I guess I'm next. My name is Gerardo. I'm a project manager for Thales International. More specifically, I work in the Global Innovation Center for Talent Acquisition. We're a team that's completely dedicated to innovation, creativity, anything that comes in the new wave of talent acquisition, right? Part of those responsibilities are, of course, AI and DEI. So yeah, so it's very, very in tune with what we're going to be speaking about today. Besides that, I'm also a project manager. As you can imagine, I do everything from talent management, risk management, stakeholder management, and everything related to making better processes for talent acquisition globally. As Thales International, we are in around, if I'm not mistaken, 28 countries. So as you can imagine, the scope and the nuances of every country and every region is a little bit different. So it's a lot of fun to be a project manager for this company.
Thank you both. We are very happy to have you on the panel today. And now that we are all acquainted, let's get straight to it and talk AI, hiring, and bias. I'd actually really like to get straight to the really actionable stuff. I'd like to start by asking each of you what your favorite use case for AI in recruitment is. Could you walk us through it? How do you put it into practice? What are the advantages? That kind of thing. Ed, do you think you could go first?
Absolutely, thank you. Um, I think for me and a lot of the people that I speak with, writing assistants tends to be a really great use of AI, especially if we're talking about AI in the realm of large language models, things like ChatGPT and Google Gemini, which is really, I think, what everybody means when they say AI these
Mm.
days. Um, those tools, the straight chat tools like ChatGPT, as well as some of the specialist applications that are out there, like Textio or Grammarly. They can be such helpful tools as part of a recruiter's day whenever we need to create content. And there are so many use cases when that comes up. For me personally, I like using it as part of writing emails. If I'm going to email a candidate, if I'm going to put together maybe an automated drip campaign, um, that sort of writer's block at the beginning of that process is very common, and sometimes just getting a little bit of assistance to get started can make a big difference to how long it takes me to get my job done and the quality of the final output. And all of those chat tools are absolutely fantastic at being able to take some of the basic details about what you're trying to achieve, and then develop some templates or some content that will get you started, which you can then go through and review and tailor and change to be authentic to your voice and your company's voice before actually using as part of the recruiting process. Similarly, job descriptions, whether we be trying to write something new from scratch, or whether we be trying to take something that we've already got and give it a little bit of a polish so it's going to stand out on our job website or career website, those tools can be really useful for helping with that process. In our organization, we are very focused on making sure that we are using open and inclusive language and that we're
Mhm.
encouraging the broadest number of people to apply. And whether it be a tool like Textio that's specifically designed to help you find the areas that you can improve, or whether it be asking ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot to take a look at your email or your job description and make suggestions as to how you can be more inclusive or encourage people from underrepresented groups to apply, those tools can do a really great job of helping you make some of those changes and going down the right path, especially if you don't have an organization that has the internal resources and departments that can really help you drive that for you. Um, I, I think with all of these things though, you do have to take it with a grain of salt.
Mm.
These systems are automated. They're not necessarily coming from a place of expertise. So one of the things that we always recommend is that you can't take a person out of the loop.
Mhm.
ChatGPT might be able to create a great email template for you, but it's not going to do that in your authentic voice, or with your company's missions and values incorporated throughout. Some of the suggestions that you see are not necessarily going to be appropriate to use. So being aware of what works and what doesn't work and where the pitfalls are of using these systems and making sure that an informed person is actually taking that output and making it ready for consumption or use outside of the organization. It's a really critical step in ensuring that you have really high quality content that's going to be effective, that's doing the right things, and that you're not necessarily starting off on the wrong foot with those processes.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that gives us
Mm,
yeah, a couple of use cases where AI could come in particularly
mm,
handy. I'm going to add a note that's probably quite niche, but if there are any of our French audience, obviously I'm based in France, and écriture inclusive, so inclusive writing, because obviously in the French language you have like masculine and feminine, you have genres for your words. Using ChatGPT to rewrite or to help you write in an
mm.
inclusive way in the French language is very useful, something that I use quite often. So yeah, that's quite a niche tip, but for any of our French listeners, that's where AI could come in handy also. Gerardo, do you think you could share some of your favorite use cases also?
Sure thing. So I think AI right now is part of our day. As a project manager, I use it a lot for everything that you could possibly imagine, from risk management to timeline generation to everything else. There's a great introduction course for how to use generative AI for project management. It's from the PMI. I think we're gonna send out links later, right? So maybe we can include that one as well. It's a great course that can show you how to do risk management and everything else, all based on conversational AI and everything else. So it's really great. It's really easy to use. When it comes to being a hiring manager and recruitment itself, it's great for job descriptions, job profiles, and anything else you want to do. And as you said, if you want to do anything more inclusive, if you want to see if it's clear, if you want to see if it's something more accessible, then putting a job description into a conversational model and seeing how you can improve it, how you can make it better. That's really great for recruitment itself. It's a win-win, right? You're making it more inclusive, you're making it more accessible for everybody that's probably going to see it on a job board. It's probably going to see it on a job site, or including in your career site, right? So it's really good to make that very inclusive. I agree with Ed. I also use it almost every day for my emails. It's pretty much a must do. I have a funny story from a former team member of mine that just started using ChatGPT to send recruitment emails. And I told her that I could tell that she started using ChatGPT because the wording and everything else was changing from how she usually did it. So it's certainly something that can really help in your day to day, especially when you're a recruiter that you're sending I don't know how many emails every day to I don't know how many people, and you have to keep up with your candidates and everything else and hiring managers. So it's definitely a great use case. Yeah, and I think those are the main ones in our day to day.
Or even like filling in if you have so for emails, for example, if you have that email template that you've worked on and that you've combed through to make sure that it does sound authentic, if you want to use that template and then you have like a list of candidate information and you want AI, ChatGPT, or another tool to go through and to replace like the names or the job description, found the job title, sorry, something like that, you can also do that, like provide the template, provide a list, and it'll go tick 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 tick, tick and fill that in. If you don't, obviously, if you're not already equipped with a tool that will do that for you. So I think we've talked about some of the things that it can be where AI can be really useful. But we also sort of touched on the risk, I guess, the risk of sort of tone and voice that doesn't represent your company or that doesn't sound like you, that's not authentic. I think that is a big one of the risks and something that you need to be careful to avoid when just starting to use AI. Um, I wanted to ask Ed, Edward and Gerardo if there were any safeguards you could put in place, like how can you make sure that you avoid sort of making those mistakes in the first place, sort of avoid how do you avoid making it obvious that you're using AI and making it non-authentic?
I'm happy to jump in and start with that one. I think the most important thing is for the people who are using the tools to understand the limitations of the platforms and what they provide. If you're using a ChatGPT-like tool, something like a large language model, you are introducing bias in the process. There is no way around it. These systems are not intelligent. There's no huge brain behind ChatGPT. It's really just a giant collection of text that is found like all over the internet. And it's producing the most likely output based on the order of the words. When you put enough computing power behind it, enough text in its library, it's incredibly impressive. It looks like it's actually making decisions and doing intelligent things, but it's just regurgitating the information that it's previously found on the internet. And all that information comes from us, and we're all inherently biased. And people talking on the internet are probably more inherently biased than the general population. And all of this has gone in the tool, and it's impacting the output that's coming out of these systems. There was a great study in Bloomberg just about 3 weeks ago that we'll share as one of the links today, where they did a really in-depth analysis of what happens when you take a whole bunch of job descriptions and resumes that are all exactly the same, except the names on the resumes have been changed to signify certain racial groups. And they asked ChatGPT to go through and rank these resumes in order for about 50 different job descriptions. And there is an enormous difference as to how the tool is ranking those resumes based on just the name. Like nothing else in those resumes is any different. It happens across like 20 different job categories that they tested. It's a wonderful study if you care about this sort of thing. And that's inherent to large language models. It's not ChatGPT being biased, but you'll get the same results if you plug it into a Microsoft Copilot or a Google Gemini type tool.
Mm-hmm.
Large language models are really great at being super convincing and being super confident about what they say, and then regurgitating complete lies and misfacts as part of what's coming out of these systems. So it really does come down to the user to make sure that they're paying a lot of attention to what these tools are doing, and that there is human intervention and cross-checking involved in making sure that the output is actually suitable for what you're trying to achieve. For us, we always say, don't take a human out of the loop. About the worst thing that you can do with AI right now is completely automate a process, especially
Mm.
one that involves making an employment decision or ranking a resume or deciding who to interview. It's just not doing those things anywhere near well enough to be acceptable as part of the recruiting process. Um, it's super important to understand the vendors that you're working with. Are they audited? Are they transparent? How do these things work? How
Mm.
accurate can you expect the results to be? And what kind of things might be going wrong? Where should you be looking for bias? And how can you proactively seek out and identify these things? A trend that we've started to see, especially in large international organizations, is this kind of AI recruiting enablement is being provided top down, where organizations are rolling out interview training, bias training,
Mm-hmm.
tool training, specifically talking about how these systems work and how users should interact with them, and where you really need to focus your attention to make sure that you're doing things that aren't going to expose your organization to potential liability, but also give you the right candidate experience, and make sure that you're hiring the right people for the right reasons in a really objective way. We're really in our infancy of these tools. We don't understand how they work in a lot of cases. They can be very black box.
Mm.
I think regardless of what you're using, the key message here is that you're gonna have some bias involved in the tools themselves, and you really do need responsible, reliable humans in the loop to make sure that the output is working as expected.
Absolutely. I think that's lots of good points. And thank you for bringing us sort
Mm,
of back to the main topic here, which is obviously trying to avoid to introduce bias. I think we touched on a couple of things that you want to protect is the integrity of your employer brand
mhm,
and your tone and voice. But obviously, yes, the subject today is how you can also avoid bias, mitigate bias, identify bias within your process. And yeah, I think Ed, there were lots of really great tips on how to avoid introducing bias when you start using AI. Have either of you could either of you go into more detail about sort of you were saying sort of this enablement, um, policies, guidelines? What have you seen? What already exists out there, and how would you recommend going about creating those guidelines? Who should own that project?
mhm.
I don't know if Gerardo, there's if you could share maybe what's happening at TELUS International.
Sure. So when it comes to, like, as you said, putting some safeguards into place, there are some things you can do internally, and there are some things that you have to do externally, because not every company has the opportunity to create, for example, a large language model from scratch.
Yeah.
They probably most likely are using ChatGPT. They're probably using Gemini or something similar, and pulling information from there. Um, the first thing that I think you can do internally is training. Train your team on how to use the tools. It's like Edward that said, ChatGPT and those tools are so enticing because it's so easy to use, it's so accessible, it's there and you can use it. And it doesn't have to get to the point where you have to understand or be a data scientist to understand everything that's going on behind. It
Mm,
just has to get to the point where your team knows how to use it in a non-biased way, right?
mhm,
I always tell my team it's like having a car. You don't need to be a mechanic or like a mechanical engineer in order to understand that your car goes and you have to put it in direct and it goes and it drives. All you need to understand is how to take care of it. You need to
mm,
understand that sometimes it needs maintenance, that it needs gas, that it needs fluids and everything else, and the car runs. So it has to be the same perspective for AI, right? You need to
Mm-hmm.
understand how, you need to know Python. You need to understand how data science work and everything else. You need to understand the basic things you can control. An example
Right.
is prompt management. How do you write your prompts? Which tool are you using? For example, on the same topic you were relating to before, what are the guidelines that we can put into place? There are some conversational AI models that have guidelines into place within the
Mm-hmm.
large language model to not be biased. There's a popular one, the one that's probably the most popular one. We're gaining popularity. If you ever use TikTok or Instagram, you probably already saw a lot of videos on it, which is called Claude. Um, that generational model has inside it a thing that's called constitutional AI, which practically, besides the large language model, it is ruled also by like a constitution where it tells itself, is what I'm saying actually good? Is it sticking to my constitution and the constitution or the
Mm.
set of rules that it has? It has a lot of things like please don't be biased, keep gender things into place and
Right.
that type of things. So that's a safeguard they put inside the large language model, so you can also use it. And in a sense, you're already being less biased about it because the tool you're using itself already is being ruled by a set of guidelines that is going to help you.
Thank you. And I think, and obviously those guidelines and those rules, they will only keep growing. They will keep adding more. And as we use AI more and more, obviously the models will improve also. Um, and could you give us sort of some concrete examples of what not to do with AI? So we've talked about how you could use AI and how you could use it sort of responsibly. What should you not be using AI for? Maybe Ed, you have some thoughts.
Yeah, in the realm of recruiting and technical recruiting in
Right.
particular, um, I think it's very important to remember that candidate experience remains at the heart of recruiting. We're humans hiring humans who are going to work with humans. And in order to make good hires and make good hires quickly, we have to have a really great candidate experience. We have to have a
Hmm.
really great hiring manager experience. We're not going to get the results that we're looking for. So when you're thinking about AI tools, especially ones that are really focused on things like speed and efficiency, really think, does this actually make the candidate experience better?
Hmm.
A really common example of this is the proliferation of one-way video interviews. You're
Mm.
starting to see more and more tools that will have an AI video interviewer, or will do a recorded interview, and then try and use AI to produce insights from that for hiring teams. Um, I think, one, there's all sorts of problems from a bias standpoint, and from a hallucination standpoint, with those kinds of models in terms of whether or not you're actually getting objective output from them. But two, it's also a really poor candidate experience. I mean, if I was looking for a new job, I'm going to have lots of questions about the team and company that I'm joining. I'm going to care about culture and values, and I want the opportunity to ask those questions and make sure that the fit is going to be right on both sides. And any great candidate is going to want the same thing. So really, really thinking whether or not you're making the process better or worse for people
Mhm.
is something super important. Um, I think you have to be very, very careful about sharing personally identifiable information, or anything that's commercial in confidence to your organization. There are completely open tools that will use your data as part of their training set,
Mm.
and that is super problematic depending on what you're sharing. But there are other tools out there that are a little bit more sandboxed and will keep those things safe. And just understanding how that works and who's auditing it and what the security and compliance guidelines are, can be really, really critical. Um, the other one, and I've mentioned this sort of several times already, but completely automating things, taking a human out of the loop, is a very dangerous thing to do right now. There's a sort of meme floating around, that recruiters are a magic box, or sorry, that ATSs are a magic box that will sort of screen out resumes,
Mhm.
based on keywords. And anybody who's in the industry knows that doesn't actually happen. But AI tools are starting to make that possible. Like you could conceivably do that with a large language model if you really wanted to, and that would be a terrible thing to do. Like we see that those large language models can be really biased based on innocuous things like names or addresses on resumes. They're also not really great at being able to understand the nuances of people's experience and being able to extrapolate skills and understand all the things between the lines that a really seasoned recruiter or a hiring manager is going to be able to do. So making sure that you're not using AI to remove human oversight and humans' ability to make objective decisions, I think is really critical in terms of having a good process, making the right outcomes for your business, and in many jurisdictions, not opening yourself up to all sorts of liability associated with automating these kinds of things using artificial intelligence.
Right. Yes, thank you for that. I think so. There's obviously these are all things that I think obviously there are things that you should not do. There are ways that you can use AI um, within your recruitment process, and obviously try and safeguard those uses and try not to introduce more bias. But I also wanted to talk about the ways that you could use AI specifically to help identify bias that is already present in your recruitment process, or to help reduce that bias. So I was wondering if you had any advice or thoughts on, yeah, specifically how you can use AI to identify or to reduce bias that already exists. Maybe Gerardo, you have some ideas.
Sure. So the first thing would be know where you stand, right? Know which tools you're using. As Ed said, when you're doing a screening for a vendor or something similar, one of the questions you should include in your process is, how does your AI work?
Hmm.
You don't need to tell me the backend. You don't need to tell me how the code works, but you need to tell
Mhm.
me, is it fed by a data source that is
Mm,
actually diverse? Is everything you're giving me diverse proof, or is it going to help me? Is it going to help me reduce bias and everything else? Those are one of the things you need to know. And as I said, you need to know where to stand in order to start doing and taking decisions right towards being a non-biased company. I think that's the first step. Go ahead. I don't know if you were.
thank
That
you.
that's
Yeah,
a
Ed, did you want to, sorry, yeah, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's an absolutely great one and super important. And in more and more places around the world, that's actually becoming legislated. Like if you're not making sure that you're working with a vendor that ticks those boxes, you could get yourself in all sorts of trouble later on down the track, depending on what ends up happening. Um, I think there are some really practical things that individual recruiters and teams can do as well. We've known for a long time that the use of open and inclusive language in things like job descriptions and recruiting emails actually has a significant impact on how
Hmm.
likely people from underrepresented groups are going to be to apply or to go through the recruiting process. And there have been tools like Textio that help with that process, but tools like OpenAI and other large language models can help with that too. And Gerardo mentioned this earlier, but it all comes down to how you ask the question in a lot of
Mm,
cases. You can upload an email and say, "Hey, help me rewrite this," and you'll get an output. But you can share some content and say, "Help me rewrite this through the lens of being more open and inclusive, and find the places where my language is not hitting these criteria, and help me make this more accessible to people who would be more likely to apply." And that makes a really big difference in the output that you get from these tools.
mm,
What's really interesting, I think, and kind of scary about a lot of these models, including ChatGPT, is that you can actually ask them not to be biased as part of your prompt, and it makes a difference.
that's
That resume
scary that
review
it's not
article
default.
absolutely that resume review article that I mentioned earlier from Bloomberg, there was a follow-up done by a university whose name currently escapes me, where they basically repeated the experiment, but they changed the prompt to say,
Hmm.
please don't be biased based on race or name. And the output is completely different. So really, really thinking very carefully about how you're asking these questions and how you engineer that prompt can make a big difference to the output that you're getting. We would also recommend that you are looking very closely at the vendors that you're working with, and understanding whether or not they're applying AI that's in an ethical and moral way, as well as having the guidelines in place to ensure those
Mm.
things are really being tracked and looked for.
Yeah, I
Um,
think sometimes there's vocabulary like our magic tool or
mhm,
our automated like so what's the magic? Like trying to understand
exactly.
what is behind that. I
Mm,
think yeah, knowledge obviously is going to give you more. Knowledge is power, I want to say, even though that sounds really rubbish. But yeah, knowing more about how it works and what's behind the tools that you're using, absolutely. Sorry, go
mm.
on, Ed.
No, that's exactly the point. And one sort of more practical example of how that comes together. Um, a lot of recruiting teams, as part of their sort of DEIB initiatives, will go out and proactively recruit from underrepresented groups.
Hmm.
If I know that my organization has a challenge with women in software engineering, which is one that's been challenging for a long time, yes, I want to make my job descriptions open and inclusive, and I want to make sure that I have the right environment and culture for women to come in and be successful. But I also might want to go out and proactively find a lot of great female software engineers and entice them to come and join my organization. Historically, how do you do that? How do you go out and find women software engineers? When I first started recruiting, a reasonable way of doing that was going on LinkedIn, and writing a search based on like the top 100 most common female names in the
Hmm.
region that I was looking at. And how biased is that? Like, how many people like did I not contact because they happen to have a name that could be either male or female, or wasn't in that top 100 list? Today we have AI tools that can do that sort of thing really well, that are able to look at lots of different dimensions when thinking about whether or not somebody is part of an underrepresented group, and be very, very accurate in terms of giving you the complete set of people and a very accurate result in terms of people that fit within that criteria. So now when I go through and I'm sourcing through that list, looking for people who have the skills that I'm looking for. I've really got the complete picture, and I'm not leaving people out because their profile picture was unexpected, or their name was unexpected, or something is missing from their LinkedIn or their resume, that might make it difficult for a human to understand how somebody might fit into one of those categories. So I think that is something that we talk a lot about at SeekOut with diversity recruiting teams, and a really practical use of AI that isn't necessarily large language models, but has really changed the way that recruiting teams work in terms of making sure that they're open as inclusive as possible.
Absolutely. Um, Thank you both so much for answering those questions. I really want to get to the questions we've been receiving from the audience. So we have, I'm having a look now. Um, so we were talking about job descriptions and the vocabulary that's used, and is the wording inclusive? And so somebody in the audience asked a question specifically about age inclusiveness. So how can job descriptions be written to be age inclusive? Do you have any examples of vocabulary, for example?
Sure. So the first recommendation would be to not include anything age related in the job description, right? So I think that's the first step. Removing anything that's not necessary to the position,
Hmm.
or anything that can drive bias to the position itself or in the job description, remove it. I think it's common practice now to remove gender. It's common practice now to remove age and anything similar. So definitely do not include anything relating to the job description in any job where you're posting, in any career site you're posting, anywhere you're hosting this position, in your sourcing efforts or anything similar. That's definitely nothing to be included.
Hmm.
If it's not relevant to the position, and I hope that in the current world, most of the times it's not going to be relevant, to not include it. If you already have a job description, then as Ed said, you can use generative AI to find bias within a job description. That can be done in large language models. So if you have the job description, you can pass it and put, can you detect if there is any biased language or anything that you would consider not inclusive in the job description I included right now? And the large language model, since you gave it a good prompt and it knows what to look for, it's most likely going to give you a responsibility, and it's going to give you an answer that you can take a look at the job description itself if you
Hmm.
want to go the AI way, right?
Right. And I
Absolutely. And if you ask the question in the right way, and maybe try a few different versions of the prompt, you can get some really great results. like that and find some of those places. Um, some of the common pitfalls that you see in things like job descriptions, somebody might describe a team as work hard, play hard. That's a sort of common term, or maybe one that's
Ooh.
less common these days, thankfully. But that doesn't necessarily lend themselves to people who have families, or who might be a little bit further on in their lives than somebody who's just entering the workforce. When you're thinking about things like entry level roles, how you talk about that? Like, are you calling out that you're looking for a new graduate or an entry level person in your job description? That has certain connotations, even though you're not coming out and saying it. Like, people are going to look at that, and they're going to self-select in terms of whether or not they're going to want to apply. So your isn't just sort of what you say, but the tone and your choice of words, and ultimately your employer brand and your company culture are going to play a significant part in how people are interpreting this, and whether or not they're choosing to apply.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think everything that Ed and Geraldo have just said, all of that is things that you can use to write your prompt when asking your AI model to review the job description. So giving them those clues, giving the tool those clues as to am I using vocabulary that might make it sound like I'm looking for somebody younger, or am I using vocabulary that's recent and that might not um, resonate with older candidates that used to describe this technology or this tool in a different way. Like anything that you can think of that is like sort of still blurry for you, but that you think might help ChatGPT or any other IA tool to identify those things, go for it. Like the more complete and exhaustive your prompt, the better the result will
Mm.
be. Um, so there's also a question about sorry. Is it a good idea? So this is about what you should or shouldn't do with AI. Is it a good idea to use ChatGPT to compare two candidates' responses to a screening test or question? Do you think it helps gain perspective, or does it introduce bias?
Oof. It depends.
It's a good
I think it
question.
all depends on what kind of question it is. Like, for example, if you're
Mhm.
doing me personally, that I'm in the BPO space, I see a lot of, for example, language assessments and a lot of writing assessments. So
Hmm.
if it's something like you need to see the grammar correctness of a person, or something similar, then maybe you can use AI for that, right? If you have two texts and you want to compare them under a language model, which is precisely what it is, a language model, right? That it's going to check grammar, it's going to check how it's written, it's going to check the context and everything else. Then I think go ahead. I don't see anything
Mhm.
that's wrong with it. If it's something more complicated, if you're posing a very, I don't know, philosophical questions or something that's, I don't know, for like a manager you're hiring or something similar, then most likely the questions you're going to be posing are not going to be black and white. The most
Hmm.
likely
Mhm.
are going to have a complexity within them, and there's going to be a lot behind it. It's almost like if you have like a specific answer and a specific answer for somebody else, it's not as if one's going to be better than the other. And you can check that through AI, because in the end, what an conversational AI is going to do is going to check the writing itself and the context itself, but it's not going to give you the context behind your interview and behind your goal for the recruitment process. So if you're going to use it for that, give the context to the chat itself or to the AI itself. Tell them, okay, I'm looking for a manager position. What I'm looking for is for the person to have leadership qualities and to be able to solve hard problems. For example, like this one I posed in the following question, where I gave them I don't know, a case where I had to let somebody go from the company, and I wanted to see how they handled it.
Hmm.
Here's the first answer. Here's the second answer. Take a look at it. In the end, it's prompt writing, right? It's not going to give you the best answer, but it's a way to use AI in order to see how the answers can be compared and how you're going to use it. And it all comes back again to the same thing we've been saying with Ed. Know how you write your prompt, and that's going to make a huge difference in what the AI understands and what's going to give you out.
Exactly. And
Yeah, I
I
also
think
don't think it's
possibly this might be in the case of a technical question, sort of a
Mhm.
coding question or something like that. I know a lot of people in the audience are recruiting for tech
Mhm.
roles. So just bearing that in mind, Ed, if you have any advice.
Yeah, I mean, so the question was, can it give us some insights, and can it introduce bias? And
Mm.
I think the answer is yes and yes.
Yeah.
It's not inherently a bad thing. Think about maybe we've had somebody do a take-home assignment or
Mhm.
write a piece of code or share something with us from their GitHub account as part of the interview process. We might ask a large language model whether the code is correct, whether it compiles and runs, whether or not it solves the problem, and it might be able to tell us that, and maybe they both solve the solution. But does that actually tell us whether or not it was written in a good way and it meets the guidelines and standards? Is it the most optimal way of doing it? Does it fit
Mm.
into our organization? There's all sorts of things that we can think about. So I think using something like a large language model to make that comparison might provide the reviewer with some insights that they hadn't previously considered and might include some additional information that would be useful. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. I mean, even today, things like GPT-4 are not even getting mathematical equations completely correct, and
Mm.
you're nothing more black and white than that.
Right.
So you can't completely trusted as to whether or not a piece of code actually runs or is secure or whether it's done right. Um, and you should never automate the process. So I think if you take it to that next step and say which of these people should move forward in the interview based on the code they supplied, that's a very biased thing to do, and it's most likely going to be wrong and result in you moving people forward for the wrong reasons. But using it to get some extra information and making sure that a person involved that is reviewing understands that it might be wrong and has the context and experience to make their own objective judgments about the output, I think that can be a beneficial part of the hiring process for sure.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see here. So we've talked about documentation and policies, that kind of thing, and we talked about sort of vetting your vendors and understanding how they use AI. So one of the questions is, how common is it today for vendors to have responsible AI documentation? Is it a major red flag if they don't?
Oh, so it's common. I think it's a great step that the industry has been taking towards being more DEI inclusive and tolerant.
Hmm.
You see most of the vendors right now having a section for DEI, for inclusiveness, for non-biased. But again, ask away. Whenever you're
Mm.
doing a vendor session, whenever you're seeing a vendor, um, I see a lot of people, and I've seen cases where they ask like the basic things, like what's the cost, how many users am I gonna get, and everything else,
Hmm.
but they never get to the point where they ask you, for example, where is your information being sourced from? How does your model work? Is it inclusive? Is it going to be biased or anything similar? So ask away,
Hmm.
do your proper search when you're vetting a vendor, right? Um, Try to take a look at everything they're doing and see behind it. As I said, I do think in the industry it's a growing trend, and a lot of people are including it now in their tools. So it's good to know about it, but always ask. Always ask.
Mm.
Know how it works. Know what the potential caveats could be, right? Where there's still bias and everything else, because it's going to help you in when you decide for a vendor.
Right. And I think if you, so obviously talking to your team internally, if you have a cybersecurity team or your tech team or anybody who can help you to sort of identify those questions, but you could also use AI to help you sort of list those questions. If you have a template or a list of questions for vetting a vendor, and you could ask ChatGPT, for
Mhm.
example, it's like, what questions could I add to find out more about how they are storing data or how they're using
Mhm.
artificial intelligence or how they're like, if you're not sure how to word those questions, that's actually something that AI itself could help you with.
Correct. Yeah,
And sort
and
of,
and I think the number one tip I can give you is um, do and try to learn the concept of red teaming. So red teaming in AI is practically attacking whatever you want to use and seeing how biased it is. So like for
mhm,
example, if you're using ChatGPT, ask ChatGPT those difficult questions and you're gonna see how biased it is and you're gonna know where the areas of opportunity are. Do the same for the vendors you're seeing. If you're gonna see a vendor, ask for a demo, ask for something similar, and ask those difficult questions, and you'll see, are there safeguards in place? What's the answer that it's giving me? Are there
mhm,
areas of opportunities? Is the model working pretty good? Red teaming is definitely a growing trend when testing large language models. So it's something you can put into use. You can use other large language models to do this red teaming. Like, for example, as you said, if you're testing something, you can ask ChatGPT what would be difficult questions to ask regarding, for example, diversity bias, gender bias, or something similar. And you can ask that to the tool or to the vendor you're vetting. And you're going to be able to see how inclusive they are. It's a good idea.
Thank you. Ed, I have another question for you. You mentioned sort of external certifications and audits. So there was a question about how important is it to externally audit your hiring practices, especially in regard to inclusivity and AI use?
That's an interesting question. Um, you know, I don't think that you necessarily need external audits of your hiring practices, especially if you have the um, maturity and experience within your organization to be able to do those things from the inside. Um, a very small team, a team of one, might not necessarily have access to resources and leadership and mentorship that can help ensure diversity and inclusion and openness right throughout the hiring process. But as you grow in size and as you start moving into the enterprise or international space, I think it becomes very common to have experienced TA leaders who've been there and done that in this place, to have HR organizations that include diversity or DEIB as part of their process, and can provide a lot of the oversight and direction that you need in terms of making sure that you're doing the right thing. A lot of this sort of varies by jurisdiction as well. I mean, in the USA, we have protected classes. There are many things that can open you up to liability if you are discriminating against people or if you are not running an open and inclusive process. What you do as part of your recruiting, so the way that you run your process, the interviews, the interview notes, the decisions that you make, these are actually discoverable. So you need to store these things in your ATS, and the government can come and ask for them if they need it, or you can be sued and you might have to bring that with you to court. So maintaining a process that is documented and has records associated with it is very important. But I think it is actually relatively unusual to have an external audit come through and look at the recruiting process as a whole, unless you're in a position where you're looking at the data and you're seeing that the hires that you're making or that the interviews that you're running are not open and inclusive, and you're not hitting your DIB goals, and you don't know what's going wrong or how to resolve that problem, then bringing in maybe some expert consultants or some new talent into the organization who have experience in that space can help you go back on the right track. I think on the sort of topic of audits as a whole, the one sort of area where it's really important as part of this topic, I think is your vendors are something you should be thinking about. Coming back to that sort of AI black box, there is this tremendous opportunity for these systems to do harm or to be biased. And in the USA at least, there's and in many parts of Europe, there's quite a lot of legal liability associated with that. If you're, for example, hiring people who are based out of New York, there's a limited employment decision law that you have to comply with. And part of that is that you can only work with AI vendors who've been externally audited. So understanding how that works and how much effort your vendors have put into the process is probably pretty important. But I wouldn't think the vast majority of recruiting processes need external audits unless they feel that they don't have the skills and experience internally, or they're looking at the data and they're seeing results that don't line up with their expectations.
And I'd underline the importance of looking at the data, looking at the results, whether you are going to turn to an external consultant or whether you're going to externalize some analysis. Obviously, the first step is to make sure that you are carrying out that analysis internally, that you are looking at the data, that you're looking at each step of your hiring process, and that you're sort of setting apart the time to analyze that and to identify areas of improvement, or areas that sort of need a closer look at. And I think, like you were saying, obviously documentation, anything that you have a record of can help you to do that. CodaPad has recently released a transcription feature, for example. So to have the transcription of your coding interviews, obviously it's something that both parties need to opt into. but that can be really useful for you when you want to sort of take a closer look at, well, what does a coding interview look like? What's the hiring manager saying? Are there things that I need to include in my training as training my interviewers as far as that goes? So yeah, anything that you can look at and analyze internally is already going to be a great step towards making your process more inclusive, fairer, and using AI in a responsible way. We do have time for a couple more questions. So there's a question here about candidates and their use of AI. So how do you feel about candidates openly using AI during the recruitment process in an interview, for example? I guess that's slightly different to obviously how recruiters are using AI, but yeah, how should recruiters feel about that, about candidates using AI?
We've actually had this discussion with CoderPad. I'm sure we can include in the links a webinar we did last year regarding how to use AI if you're a candidate and how you should feel as a recruiter for it. But the gist of it is there's going to be resistance from hiring managers. That's something that's right now. Why? Because AI is something so new and there's so many things happening right now that the fear is there that if a candidate is using AI, it could get to a point where it's cheating, right? And the candidate may not be qualified for the position they're applying for, and they are just getting through the process because of AI. And we understand that fear, we understand that concern. Um, but on the other side, is AI is going to be something part of our lives and part of our work lives now. Um, it's as if you asked me if when I'm interviewing for a recruiter, if they use ChatGPT to write a job description or to write an email, if it's cheating. If they're going to be doing it in their day to day and it's a tool that they're going to be using in their day to day to be better recruiters, it's not really cheating, right? It's enhancing their capabilities. And I'm going to be happy that they know how to use conversational AI to do those tasks within, and they're probably going to be prime candidates for the position. So it's finding that balance, right? Knowing that large language models, generative AI, and everything, it's probably going to be used, especially in the tech space for, as Ed said in one example, check codes, write simple prompts, do simple things that are probably going to influence how you're doing a process. On the other side, it's almost 100% impossible to have a candidate go in that doesn't have the skills for the position, right? Has to be a human in the loop, as Ed says. At some point, there's going to be an interview. At some point, there's going to be a conversation with somebody, and they're going to find out that the candidate is not qualified. So keep that in mind. Put your safeguards in place. Use good features, like for example, if you're doing a technical assessment, I can give the example of CoderPad. They have video proctoring, they have code playback. Those are great tools you can use in order to see if somebody is using generative AI or AI in a way that they should not be doing it. And on the other side, educate hiring managers that AI is a good thing, right? That most likely it's not all going to be bad. And then in case that somebody's taking it overboard or somebody's going over what they should be using AI for, that you have the safeguards in place in order to identify that, and that you're going to flag it if it happens.
And I think I don't know if Ed, you want to add something. I just wanted to share a number from our State of Tech Hiring 2024. So we found, and I think this number has probably grown since we surveyed end of last year, but 67% of developers are already using AI as part of their job, like on a daily basis. So it definitely is part of their toolbox. It's something that they use to do their job. So making that part of the hiring process, for me, that's a relevant use of AI for a technical candidate in any case. Ed, was there anything you wanted to add to that question, or shall
No,
I see if
I
I have one
agree
more?
with all of that. I mean, I think in some ways this question is about as old as the internet. Any tech recruiters in the audience here today who've been part of coding interviews with their hiring managers have probably had the experience of a hiring manager coming in complaining after the interview that their candidate used Google as part of solving the question, and
Stack
therefore is
Overflow.
cheating and is not a good Stack Overflow.
Stack Overflow,
And
yeah.
what a I mean, I'm very opinionated about this topic, but that is not an appropriate thing to complain about, right? Like, is your engineering team not looking up the solution to problems as part of their work? Are they not looking on Google and Stack Overflow? Do you expect people to pull out the reference manual and solve every problem from first principles? Like, you think about how you're actually doing work. And what are you hiring for? Like, are you hiring for somebody that has, the entire of the syntax of this language memorized and available like at their fingertips? Or are you hiring for somebody who can solve problems for you and do it in a fast and efficient and secure way? And if it's the latter, the output matters a lot more than how they actually got there. There's a big difference between like faking your entire interview with ChatGPT and leveraging a tool to be fast and getting the right outcomes. But and again, that's where the human comes into it. But I always feel that you really need to think about like what success looks like in a role and how your team actually works in real life. And your interview process should reflect that. You should hire for people who are going to fit in and be successful and work the way that you want people to work, not for people who are really great at memorizing things, unless that happens to be the problem at hand.
Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. And I think if somebody can use ChatGPT or another AI tool to get all the way through your hiring process and into the position, there's something wrong with your hiring process. I think we have time for one last question. I saw a question about company guidelines. So internally, who do you think should own the creation and maintenance of AI company guidelines? Is it HR? That's the question.
I think that's a really difficult one, and we're so early in the adoption of these tools and our understanding of how they work and the potential impacts that they can have. There aren't really specialists or an
Nobody's
established
an
knowledge base
expert,
in this area.
really.
In our organization, we have an ethical AI council, and it's made up of cross-functional leadership that includes HR, diversity and inclusion, engineering, which is very important because this is a technical problem, legal, as well as some of the company's senior leadership team. And that way we can bring perspectives from different groups into this and make sure that we're really considering the breadth of the problem depending on what the application is. And I think at least right now, like until we get to the point where there is like a chief AI officer, even though that job title is starting to pop up, you really do need cross-team support and probably a little council or committee in most cases to make sure that you're looking at the challenge from all of the different angles.
I think that's a really interesting approach. Gerardo, I don't know if there are company-wide guidelines at TELUS International and who owns those.
So from our end, we own it as talent acquisition. It might be cliche to say this, but the change starts with you and with your team, right? So we have a set of guidelines and rules that we use to rule our AI use, which in our case is chatbots, conversational AI for recruitment purposes and similar. But I do agree that it as Ed said, it needs to be taken to a bigger point, right? There should be company-wide guidelines. We're very fortunate to have a big AI team, and they write great articles and everything else. If I'm not mistaken, our AI director on growth and innovation just did a webinar on building trust in AI, which is to say they have an idea on what's going on in the company, they have an idea on what's going on in the market, and they're working towards building guidelines and trust in our AI models inside TELUS International. So that's a great initiative by the company.
Thank you both for sharing the sort of your company's approach. I think that's really interesting to hear. We are coming to the end of our webinar. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Thank you for all of your questions and for being with us for this discussion. Thank you, Gerardo and Edward, for joining our panel. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you. And I wish everybody a good day, evening, afternoon, morning, whatever it is where you are. And happy hiring. And I hope to see you soon. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.